I'm Susan McGinnis with Clean Skies News. We're at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh at the August Wilson Center, and I'm joined now by Larry Schweiger. He is President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. Larry, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Now, Pittsburgh as a locale for this international meeting, the spotlight on this town especially has a special significance to you.
It does, because I was born and raised, and in fact still keep my home here in Pittsburgh. And it's an interesting city because Pittsburgh has come from a very dirty city. It was once called the Smoky City, most polluted in the world. And now is a city that has reinvented itself with new energy, with innovation, with green buildings, and just a revitalization of the entire economy. And it's moving in a green energy direction.
It certainly must be to have been chosen for this event. Were you surprised?
We were pleased. Yeah. We've been proud of our city for a long time. It has been selected as the most livable city on a number of occasions, and most recently by The Economist magazine. So Pittsburgh has been, it has this reputation of being a dirty old city, and that's just not true.
Well, it's certainly changing now with the eyes of the world on the green initiatives. I mean, do you really think that Pittsburgh can be looked to as an example, as far as knowing how you guys got here, the strategy you used and the funding you used to make these changes for other cities around the country and around the world to do the same?
Absolutely, and I think if I were to talk to a city that's struggling and having difficulties with a declining industry, I would say have an imagination, create a vision for your future, and build on that vision. And that's what happened here in Pittsburgh. It started in the 50s, built in the 60s, and when the steel industry collapsed in the 70s, it was poised for a new direction, and it took that direction.
So tell me, moving on to the National Wildlife Federation mission here, what do you think that these G20 ministers need to be focused on as concerns your goals?
Well, wildlife are in the bullseye of global warming. The scientists have warned us that we may lose up to 30% or even 40% of our total species on the planet. We could lose 1 million animals and fish and plant life species. And so we're hopeful that we can get a conversation started here that will lead to Copenhagen. The 20 nations that are here produce about 80% of the total carbon emission. So if these nations will come together with a common understanding that we need to set hard goals, we need to hold each other accountable, we need to move in new directions, and do that, they can lead the rest of the world and solve this problem.
When we hear about the risk of global warming and all of the effects and droughts and sea level rise and migrations coming as a result of it, and we're actually seeing the first large-scale migrations of some more than 1,500 people off of the coast of Papua New Guinea. Yep. Most of the talk is about humans. I mean, do you think that the spotlight is not on wildlife and plant life enough?
It's not on wildlife enough. I just wrote a book called Last Chance, Preserving Life on Earth, and it's about the wildlife story and how wildlife are being impacted. But I think it's false as humans to assume that somehow whatever happens to wildlife won't affect us.
Right.
When we lose the supporting structure of our fisheries and our oceans, we're talking about huge amounts of food that serve the rest of the world.
But when you talk about adaptation and mitigation, do you believe that we need specific policies or specific strategies for animal life in those two categories?
Absolutely. In fact, we're proposing in the federal legislation to take 5% of the auction revenue and use that money coming out of the carbon auctions to actually address some of the adaptation that needs to occur in coastal areas, in migratory corridors, and also invest in improving the resilience of these important ecosystems.
How do you help wildlife cope with these kinds of effects, storms and rising sea levels?
Well, I think a good example is what's happened in New Orleans. New Orleans at one time had vast areas for many, many miles below New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico of grasses and trees, and that was a buffer for the city, but it was also the habitat for wildlife. So by restoring these great buffers, by restoring these one-time important ecosystems, we can also protect human populations. So we can do both at the same time, and that's the kind of thing we think needs to happen.
There's not a lot of talks scheduled from here on in until the December talks in Copenhagen. Are you troubled at all by the slow pace of progress there, or are you optimistic?
Well, I think it's important here in the U.S. to pass a climate bill in the Senate. That will give the framework for the President of the United States to go to Copenhagen. Because without the U.S. at the table, this is yet another missed opportunity for international negotiations.
Nobody is talking about climate legislation passing the U.S. in time for Copenhagen anymore?
Well, I think it's important that we get it passed the Senate, not necessarily out of conference committee, but I think we should be thinking about moving a bill before Copenhagen.
So you think it's possible?
I think it's absolutely not impossible, but it's the responsible thing for us to do.
If not, what can be accomplished in Denmark?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for the president to go to Denmark without having any clear message from the Congress. And it makes it very difficult to negotiate an international treaty when you don't have a clear signal from the other branch of government that ultimately has to ratify any agreement that comes out of Copenhagen.
It delays the most important parts, which are the specifics, the numbers, the targets.
Exactly. And it also it gives a better sense of clarity in terms of what we can actually argue for and what we do, because we're such a dominant player in all this. What we do will influence the outcome of Copenhagen. So in the past, we've missed opportunities to be leaders. We've been lagging, and this is our opportunity, but it requires that we move quickly.
Right. All right. Well, we will be following your efforts, Larry Schweiger, CEO of the National Wildlife Federation.
Thank you.
And I'm Susan McGinnis at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh, reporting for Clean Skies News.